The sun was just beginning to dip below the horizon, painting the quiet town in shades of amber and rose. Most people were finishing their dinners or settling into their evening routines, unaware of the unusual scene unfolding on Maple Street. The wail of an ambulance shattered the calm, its flashing lights reflecting off the windows of the sleepy shops that lined the road. At first, the driver didn't see the obstacle ahead. But as they rounded the corner, there it was, a scruffy dog, planted firmly in the middle of the road. The animal was unlike anything the driver had ever encountered in such a situation. Its coat was matted, its ribs faintly visible beneath the dirty fur. Yet, it stood there as if it belonged, its posture unwavering, its eyes locked on the ambulance. "Is that a dog?" the paramedic in the passenger seat asked, leaning forward. "It's not moving," the driver replied, tapping the horn in a series of short, impatient bursts. The dog didn't flinch. Passers-by began to gather, their curiosity piqued by the unusual standoff. Some pointed, others pulled out their phones to record the strange sight. A few children tugged at their parents' sleeves, whispering questions about why the dog wouldn't move. But to the driver, this was more than an inconvenience. There was something about the dog's eyes, deep pools of urgency and determination. It wasn't just standing there, it was pleading. "What do you think it's trying to do?" the paramedic asked, her voice softer now. "I don't know," the driver said, his hand hovering over the steering wheel. "But it's not random." For years, Max, the scruffy mutt who now blocked the ambulance, had been a familiar but largely ignored figure in the town. He was the kind of dog that blended into the background, a stray with no collar, no home, and seemingly no purpose. He lived on the fringes, scavenging behind diners and dodging impatient shopkeepers. To most, he was just that dog, a nuisance at best, a problem at worst. Children would sometimes try to befriend him, offering scraps of sandwiches or cookies. But Max always kept his distance, his cautious nature keeping him from trusting too much. Yet, tonight was different. Tonight, Max wasn't wandering aimlessly or avoiding the kicks of frustrated shop owners. Tonight, he had a mission. The crowd around the ambulance grew, and the whispers turned into murmurs of annoyance. "Just drive around it," an older man called out, his voice tinged with irritation. "Why don't they honk louder?" another suggested. But the driver ignored them, his eyes fixed on the dog. He couldn't explain it, but something told him this wasn't a situation to be rushed. Max barked once, a sharp, commanding sound that echoed through the street. He glanced over his shoulder, as if urging the ambulance to follow, then looked back at the driver, his eyes filled with urgency. "I think it wants us to go with it," the paramedic said, her voice laced with wonder. "Follow a dog," the driver scoffed, but his hand hesitated on the gear shift. Max barked again, taking a few steps forward before stopping to look back. His message was clear: "Come with me." "What if it's leading us somewhere important?" the paramedic asked. "What if someone needs help?" The driver frowned but relented, easing his foot off the brake. Slowly, the ambulance began to follow the dog, the crowd parting to let them pass. The streets of the town grew narrower as Max led them through alleys and side roads. The ambulance's flashing lights illuminated the path, revealing piles of discarded furniture, cracked sidewalks, and overgrown weeds. "Where is this mud taking us?" the driver muttered under his breath. But the paramedic couldn't take her eyes off Max. She noticed the way his tail wagged, not in playfulness, but in what seemed like determination. His ears twitched with every sound, his nose occasionally dipping to the ground as if checking the trail. The tension in the ambulance was palpable. Every corner they turned felt like a gamble. Would this lead them to something real, or was it just the wild instincts of a stray? And then, as they approached an old, crumbling warehouse on the edge of town, Max stopped. The building was barely standing, its windows broken, its walls streaked with graffiti. Max barked again, this time more urgently, and darted toward the entrance. "Stay here," the driver said, grabbing a flashlight and stepping out of the ambulance. "I'm coming too," the paramedic said, not waiting for permission. The two of them followed Max into the darkened structure, their footsteps echoing on the cold concrete floor. The air was thick with dust and the faint smell of mildew. "Do you hear that?" the paramedic whispered. The driver stopped, straining his ears. Then he heard a faint, muffled cry. "Help!" The sound sent a chill down their spines. Max barked again, his tail wagging furiously as he led them deeper into the building. As they rounded a corner, the beam of the flashlight landed on a huddled figure. A woman sat on the floor, clutching a small child to her chest. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with fear. "Please, help us," she croaked. Max ran to her side, nuzzling her arm as if to reassure her. The child stirred, letting out a weak cry. Without hesitation, the paramedic dropped to her knees, checking their vitals. "They're dehydrated," she said. "And the boy has a fever. We need to get them out of here now." The driver radioed for backup, his voice steady but urgent. As he relayed the situation, his eyes kept drifting back to Max, who sat protectively by the woman's side, his eyes never leaving her. By the time the second ambulance arrived, the woman and child were safely loaded onto stretchers. The paramedic turned to Max, giving him a small smile. "You knew, didn't you?" she said softly. Max wagged his tail, his job done. Back on Maple Street, the crowd had dispersed, the excitement fading as quickly as it had begun. But for the driver and paramedic, the night was far from ordinary. "Think he'll stick around?" the driver asked as they watched Max trot away into the night. The paramedic shrugged, a thoughtful look on her face. "Maybe. Or maybe he'll just keep saving lives in his own way." In the distance, Max disappeared into the shadows, his scruffy silhouette a reminder that heroes don't always wear capes or even collars. The medics were back in the ambulance now, driving slowly toward the hospital. They couldn't stop glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the scruffy dog following them. But Max was gone, melting back into the shadows of the town as quickly as he had appeared. The paramedic, still shaken by the encounter, leaned her head against the window. "I can't stop thinking about him," she said. "The dog?" the driver asked, casting her a sideways glance. "Yeah," she replied. "It's like, he knew. He knew they were in there, and he knew we were the only ones who could help." The driver chuckled softly, though there was no humor in it. "Lucky guess, maybe. Or just blind instinct." But the paramedic wasn't convinced. "Instinct doesn't explain everything. Did you see how he stayed with her, like he wasn't going to leave until she was safe? That's not just instinct, that's something else." Neither of them spoke for a while after that, the weight of the night settling over them. As the ambulance disappeared into the distance, Max paused at the edge of the alley, his ears twitching at the faint hum of its sirens fading away. For a moment, he stood still, his head tilting slightly as if contemplating his next move. This wasn't the first time Max had intervened in the lives of humans, though few had ever noticed. To most, he was just a stray, a nuisance to shoo away, a nameless face that blended into the background. But Max knew better. He navigated the streets with the ease of someone who had walked them 1,000 times, his paws avoiding broken glass and jagged stones as he trotted toward his usual resting spot behind the diner. It was late now, and the town had fallen into its quiet rhythm, the kind that came after the chaos of the day. The alley behind the diner was dimly lit, the only illumination coming from a flickering street lamp at the corner. Max sniffed the air, catching the familiar scent of discarded food and grease. But tonight, he wasn't interested in scavenging. Instead, he curled up beneath a pile of old cardboard boxes, his body forming a tight circle to keep warm. He closed his eyes, but sleep didn't come easily. The images of the woman and child lingered in his mind: her pale face, the child's frail whimper, the way she had clung to him as if he were her lifeline. Max wasn't just a stray. He was a protector, a silent guardian who saw things others didn't. And though his world was small, a few alleys, a couple of quiet streets, he understood more about people than they would ever know. To the people of the town, Max was just another stray, one of many that roamed the streets. The shopkeepers complained about him knocking over trash cans, the kids sometimes threw pebbles to scare him off, and the older residents shook their heads, muttering about how someone should do something about all the dogs running loose. But no one ever did. Max was used to it. He had learned to navigate a world that didn't have a place for him, slipping between shadows and staying out of trouble. He wasn't bitter, he didn't have time for bitterness. There were moments, though, when he wished things were different. Like when he passed the park and saw families laughing together, children chasing after their well-groomed pets. Or when the first snow of the season fell, and he watched people bundle up in warm coats while he shivered under the awning of an abandoned shop. But Max wasn't one to dwell. He had purpose, even if the world didn't see it. The morning after the rescue, news of the mysterious dog began to spread. It started with the paramedic, who couldn't stop talking about him as she clocked out of her shift. "You should have seen him," she told a colleague in the break room. "He didn't just lead us there, he stayed. Like he knew exactly what he was doing." Her colleague raised an eyebrow, skeptical. "A stray dog leading you to a woman and her kid? Sounds like a coincidence to me." "Maybe," she said, though her tone suggested she didn't believe that for a second. By the end of the day, the story had made its way to the local diner, where the regulars gathered to sip coffee and trade gossip. "You hear about the dog that stopped an ambulance?" one man asked, stirring his cup. "Yeah, I heard," another replied. "Crazy, isn't it?" "What are the odds?" "More like dumb luck," a third chimed in. "Dogs don't think like that. It's just instincts." But not everyone dismissed the story so easily. A young waitress, who had often left scraps for Max behind the diner, smiled to herself as she listened. She had seen something in that dog's eyes once, something kind, something almost human. For Max, the rescue wasn't something to dwell on. The woman and child were safe, and that was all that mattered. He moved through the town as he always did, unnoticed and unbothered. But something felt different now. As he passed the diner, the waitress stepped out the back door, carrying a small plate of leftovers. "Hey, boy," she called softly, crouching down and placing the plate on the ground. Max hesitated, his cautious nature taking over. He sniffed the air, assessing whether it was safe to approach. "It's okay," the waitress said, her voice gentle. "I won't hurt you." Slowly, Max took a step forward, his nose twitching as he caught the scent of roasted chicken. He edged closer, his eyes flicking between the food and the waitress. She smiled as he began to eat, her heart warming at the sight. "You're a good boy, aren't you?" she said. "They're calling you a hero, you know. The dog that saved those people." Max didn't understand her words, but he could sense her kindness. For the first time in a long while, he didn't feel invisible. The story of Max's rescue continued to spread, reaching even the local news station. They aired a segment about the hero dog, showing a blurry video of him standing in front of the ambulance. "Local residents are calling him a guardian angel," the reporter said, her voice warm. "But no one knows where he came from or where he is now." As the town buzzed with curiosity, some people began to see Max differently. The shopkeeper who had once chased him away now left a bowl of water outside his store. A young boy who had once thrown pebbles at him now sat on the curb, hoping to catch a glimpse of the hero dog. Max, unaware of his newfound fame, continued his quiet patrols, watching over the town in his own way. The town of Willowbrook had always been a place of quiet routines. People stuck to their schedules, moved through their days with purpose, and rarely paid attention to the details that didn't concern them. And for years, Max was one of those overlooked details. To the townsfolk, Max was nothing more than a stray, a scruffy, nameless dog who roamed the streets. He was invisible to most, except when he was a nuisance. "Get outta here, you mutt," a butcher yelled one morning, waving a broom at Max, who had been sniffing too close to the shop's back door. Max darted away, narrowly avoiding the broom. It wasn't the first time someone had chased him, and it wouldn't be the last. He'd learned to survive this way, staying just out of reach, never lingering too long, and never trusting too much. Willowbrook wasn't a cruel town, but it wasn't kind either. People were busy with their own lives, their own problems. If someone noticed Max, it was usually with annoyance. "Why do these strays keep hanging around?" a woman muttered as Max sniffed at a trash bin near the cafe. "Someone should call animal control," another said. But no one ever did. Calling animal control meant taking responsibility, and in Willowbrook, no one wanted to take responsibility for a stray dog. The only kindness Max ever saw came in small, fleeting moments: a child sneaking him a piece of bread, a waitress leaving scraps behind the diner, a kind old man tossing him a biscuit from his porch. But even these acts of kindness were rare, overshadowed by the kicks, shouts, and cold indifference he faced daily. Despite the town's dismissiveness, Max had a sharp awareness of the world around him. He knew the rhythms of the town, when the bakery opened, when the streets were busiest, and which alleys were the safest to sleep in. But lately, something had shifted. The air felt different, heavier. People were more tense, their voices sharper. Max didn't understand the words they spoke, but he could feel the unease. "Heard about the break-ins?" a man said to his friend as they walked down Main Street. "Yeah, 3 houses in 1 week. It's getting out of hand," the other replied. Max didn't know what a break-in was, but he could sense the frustration in their voices. And it wasn't just those two. Everywhere he went, people seemed on edge, their movements hurried, their conversations hushed. For Max, the tension wasn't just a feeling, it was a scent in the air, a change in the way people moved. And though he couldn't explain it, he knew it was important. Max's instincts were sharper than most realized. He had always been good at reading people, sensing their intentions before they acted. And when the break-ins began, he started noticing things others didn't. One night, as he wandered near the edge of town, he caught a strange scent, a mix of sweat, metal, and something he couldn't place. It wasn't a scent he recognized, and it didn't belong in Willowbrook. He followed it, his nose leading him down a dark alley and toward a row of abandoned warehouses. He paused, his ears swiveling at the faint sound of movement inside one of the buildings. Barking loudly, Max tried to alert someone, anyone. But his voice, hoarse from years of shouting at an indifferent world, went unheard. The next morning, Max's barking became a topic of conversation. "That dog kept me up all night," complained Mrs. Harper, who lived near the warehouses. "He's always making a racket, but last night was the worst." "Maybe he's going rabid," another resident suggested. "Someone should deal with him." No one considered that Max might have had a reason for barking. To them, he was just a nuisance, an annoyance they wished would disappear. Max returned to the warehouses the next night, drawn by the same strange scent. He didn't know what he was looking for, but he knew something was wrong. This time, he saw them. 2 figures slipped out of the warehouse, their movements quick and quiet. They carried bags slung over their shoulders, their faces obscured by the shadows. Max barked again, louder this time, his body tense as he stepped forward. "Shut that dog up," one of the figures hissed. The other bent down, grabbing a rock and hurling it at Max. It missed, clattering against the pavement, but the message was clear: stay away. Max retreated, his instincts warning him not to push further. But as he watched the figures disappear into the night, he knew he couldn't ignore what he'd seen. The next day, the town buzzed with news of another break-in. This time, it was the hardware store. "They took everything," the owner said, his voice trembling with anger. "Tools, cash, even the security cameras. It's like they knew exactly what to take." Max listened from a distance, hidden behind a stack of crates. He recognized the scent of the figures from the night before. It lingered near the store, faint but unmistakable. He barked once, drawing the attention of a few townsfolk. "Get out of here, you mangy mutt," one of them said, waving a hand to shoo him away. Max hesitated, then turned and trotted off. He wanted to help, but how could he, when no one would listen? Despite the town's hostility, Max didn't give up. He returned to the warehouses night after night, keeping watch. He began to notice patterns, the way the figures moved, the times they came and went. He picked up on their scents, their sounds, their habits. And though he couldn't speak the language of the humans, he was piecing together a picture they couldn't see. But Max wasn't the only one paying attention. The figures had noticed him too. "That dog's always here," one of them said, their voice low. "We should get rid of it." Max didn't understand their words, but he felt the threat in their tone. He stayed hidden, his heart pounding as he watched them disappear into the warehouse. One evening, as Max prowled the edge of the warehouse district, he caught a new scent, one that sent a shiver down his spine. It was the smell of smoke, faint but growing stronger. He followed it, his paws moving faster as the scent led him to a small house on the outskirts of town. The windows glowed with an eerie orange light, and the air crackled with heat. "A fire!" Without hesitation, Max barked, his voice sharp and urgent. He ran to the door, scratching at it frantically. Inside, he could hear muffled cries, a child's voice, faint and terrified. Max barked louder, hoping someone would hear. The story of Max's bravery at the fire would spread far and wide. But that moment was still in the future. For now, Max was just a stray, a dog no one cared for, underestimated by a town that didn't see his worth. And yet, in his silent strength and unwavering determination, he was more than they knew. He was a guardian, a protector, and the only one who truly understood the danger lurking in Willowbrook. Would you like me to continue with the narrative, weaving more tension and hints of Max's hidden strength? This section has exceeded 2,500 words, and I can keep expanding to meet your target. The fire was extinguished quickly, thanks to Max's relentless barking. It wasn't long before the townsfolk arrived, groggy from being pulled out of their beds by the commotion. The fire brigade worked swiftly, and the family inside the house was safe, shaken but unharmed. "What happened?" someone asked as the crowd gathered around the smoldering remains of the back room. "Faulty wiring, maybe," the fire chief muttered, scratching his head. "Could have been worse if the dog hadn't woken everyone up." Eyes turned to Max, who stood a short distance away, panting but alert. He had stayed near the house until the family was safely outside, but now, the familiar wariness in the humans' gazes made him step back. "It's just a stray," one man said dismissively. "Probably barking at shadows and got lucky." "But what if it wasn't luck?" asked a young girl, clutching her mother's hand. "What if he was trying to help?" The adults laughed uneasily, brushing off the suggestion. No one in Willowbrook liked to think too hard about the stray dog that roamed their streets. Though the fire was a turning point, it didn't change Max's place in the town. The people were grateful in the moment, but by the next day, they had returned to their routines, their suspicions of Max unchanged. "He's still a nuisance," Mrs. Harper said, shaking her head as she swept her porch. "One good deed doesn't make up for all the trouble he's caused." Trouble? Max had never caused trouble, not the kind they meant, anyway. But it didn't matter. To them, he was an inconvenience, an outsider who didn't belong. The only ones who saw Max differently were the children. They watched him with a mix of curiosity and admiration, whispering stories about how he'd saved the family from the fire. "I think he's a hero," said Jamie, a boy no older than 9, as he tossed a crust of bread to Max. "Me too," his friend Clara agreed. "But why doesn't anyone else see it?" Max, for his part, didn't care about being seen as a hero. He cared about the patterns he was noticing, the strange scents, the figures in the night, and the danger that no one else seemed to sense. As the days passed, the tension in Willowbrook grew. The break-ins continued, more brazen than before. "They hit the pharmacy last night," the sheriff said grimly, addressing a small group of concerned townsfolk. "Cleaned out half the inventory and smashed the security cameras." "What are you doing about it?" a man demanded. "We can't keep living like this." "We're doing everything we can," the sheriff replied, though the exhaustion in his voice betrayed his uncertainty. Max listened from a distance, hidden behind a cluster of bushes. He had seen the figures again the previous night, slipping through the alleys with the same deliberate movements. They were careful, but Max was more observant than they realized. He followed them as far as he dared, noting the way they avoided well-lit areas and stuck to the shadows. He caught their scent again, the same mix of sweat, metal, and something sharp and acrid. It was the same scent he had smelled near the fire. Max's instincts told him that the break-ins and the fire were connected. The figures he had been tracking weren't just thieves, they were something more dangerous. But how could he make the town see what he saw? He tried in the only way he knew how. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Max stationed himself near the warehouses again. When the figures appeared, he barked, loud and insistent, his voice echoing through the empty streets. "Quiet, you mangy mutt," one of the figures snarled, throwing another rock at him. This time, it grazed his shoulder, but Max didn't back down. His barking drew attention not from the townsfolk, but from the thieves themselves. They chased him down the alley, their shouts sharp and angry. Max darted around a corner, his heart pounding. He had no plan, only the knowledge that he couldn't let them catch him. He slipped through a gap in a fence and into a neighboring yard, where he crouched low, his body trembling with adrenaline. The thieves cursed as they gave up the chase, their footsteps fading into the distance. Max waited a long time before he moved again, his sharp eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of danger. The next morning, as Max limped through the streets, his shoulder still sore from the rock, he heard the townsfolk talking about him again. "That dog was barking all night," Mrs. Harper complained to her neighbor. "I swear, he's worse than the break-ins." "Maybe he's part of the problem," her neighbor suggested. "Dogs like that can be unpredictable." Max didn't understand their words, but he felt the hostility in their voices. He lowered his head, moving past them quickly. If only they knew. Not everyone in Willowbrook dismissed Max. There were still moments of kindness, small gestures that reminded him he wasn't entirely alone. One afternoon, Jamie and Clara found Max resting near the park. Seeing his limp, they brought him water and half a sandwich from their lunch boxes. "Here you go, boy," Jamie said softly, setting the food down in front of him. Max looked up at them, his tail wagging faintly. "Do you think he's hurt?" Clara asked, her brow furrowed with concern. "Probably," Jamie said. "But he's tough. Aren't you, Max?" Max didn't know his name, but the warmth in the boy's voice made him feel seen in a way he hadn't felt in a long time. That night, Max returned to the warehouses, determined to uncover the truth. He stayed hidden, watching as the figures moved in and out of the shadows. This time, he noticed something new, a small, unmarked van parked behind one of the buildings. The figures loaded bags into the van, their movements quick and efficient. Max crept closer, his body low to the ground. He caught the scent again, that same sharp, acrid smell that lingered near the fire. Suddenly, one of the figures turned, their eyes scanning the darkness. Max froze, his heart pounding as the figure stepped closer. "Something's out there," they muttered. "Just a stray," the other replied. "Ignore it." The figures climbed into the van and drove off, leaving Max alone in the empty alley. But he wasn't afraid. He was determined. The town didn't see what he saw. They didn't understand the danger. But Max did. And he wasn't going to stop until he protected Willowbrook, whether the town wanted his help or not. The sun had barely dipped below the horizon when Max picked up the scent again. That same sharp, acrid smell, mixed with sweat and something faintly metallic. It was a trail he had learned to recognize, and tonight, it was stronger than ever. Max moved quickly but cautiously, his paws silent against the cracked pavement. The town was quiet now, its streets deserted except for a faint flicker of light in the distance. The figures were out again, this time moving closer to the heart of Willowbrook. They didn't notice Max trailing behind them, keeping his distance but watching every move. The stray dog, ignored and underestimated, was piecing together what the humans refused to see. Max followed the figures to the edge of town, where an abandoned building stood in the shadows of a weedy lot. He paused, ears pricked forward, as he watched them unload more bags from the van. The acrid smell was overpowering now, stinging his nose. Something was wrong. He could sense it. One of the figures spoke, their voice muffled but urgent. "We'll finish the last load tomorrow night. By then, nobody will be able to trace it." Trace what? Max didn't know, but the urgency in their tone confirmed what he already felt. This wasn't just about the break-ins. Whatever they were doing, it was dangerous. The figures disappeared into the building, leaving the van behind. Max crept closer, his heart pounding. He sniffed the air, catching faint traces of chemicals and smoke. That's when he saw it. A small, torn piece of paper fluttered near the van's tire. Max nudged it with his nose, then carefully picked it up with his teeth. As dawn approached, Max limped through the town, the torn paper clutched gently in his mouth. He needed someone to see this, someone who might understand. He made his way to Jamie's house, where the boy often left scraps of food for him on the back porch. This time, Max didn't just wait for the boy to come outside. He barked, short and sharp, until a light flicked on inside the house. Jamie opened the door, rubbing his eyes. "Max? What's wrong, boy?" Max dropped the paper at Jamie's feet, wagging his tail slightly as he looked up at the boy. Jamie knelt down, picking up the torn scrap. It was smudged with dirt, but he could make out part of a label, "Handle with care, flammable." "Where did you find this?" Jamie whispered, his voice filled with a mix of curiosity and worry. Max barked again, stepping back as if to say, "Follow me." Jamie didn't hesitate. He threw on his jacket and grabbed a flashlight, then followed Max into the early morning light. "Where are we going?" Jamie asked, though he didn't expect an answer. Max led him back to the abandoned building, pausing occasionally to make sure Jamie was still following. The boy shivered as they approached, the cool air biting through his jacket. When they reached the lot, Max stopped, his body tense. He looked up at Jamie, his eyes sharp and insistent. Jamie shone the flashlight toward the building, illuminating broken windows and graffiti-covered walls. "What's in there, Max?" he murmured. The boy stepped closer, but before he could get too near, Max barked sharply, blocking his path. "You don't want me to go in?" Jamie asked, his voice trembling slightly. Max barked again, lower this time, as if to confirm. Jamie ran home, his mind racing. He tried to tell his parents about the torn paper and the abandoned building, but they waved him off. "You've been reading too many mystery books," his father said with a chuckle. "But Max led me there." Jamie protested. I think something bad is happening. His mother sighed. It's just a stray dog, Jamie. Don't let your imagination get the best of you. Frustrated but determined, Jamie decided to take the paper to the sheriff. The sheriff wasn't much more helpful. He listened patiently as Jamie explained what had happened, even taking the torn paper from him. A dog led you to this, the sheriff asked, raising an eyebrow. Yes. Max isn't just any dog, he's smart. He knows something. The sheriff chuckled, shaking his head. I'll look into it, kid, but I wouldn't get your hopes up. Dogs bark at anything, you know. Jamie left the station feeling defeated, but Max was waiting for him outside. The dog's eyes met the boys, as if to say, don't give up yet. That evening, news spread of another break-in, this time at the general store. The thieves had taken more than supplies. They had also left a message, spray-painted on the wall, "Stay out of our way." The townsfolk gathered in the square, their voices rising in fear and anger. We can't keep living like this, one man shouted. They're getting bolder, another woman added. What's next? Our homes. Max watched from the shadows, his ears twitching as he listened. He knew the town was close to understanding the danger, but they weren't there yet. Max returned to the abandoned building the next night, his determination stronger than ever. He sniffed around a lot, searching for more clues. This time, he found something alarming, a faint, hissing sound coming from inside the van. He crept closer, his nose twitching. The smell of chemicals was stronger than ever, almost overwhelming. Suddenly, a faint light flickered inside the building. The figures were back. Max crouched low, his eyes fixed on the shadows moving inside. One of the figures spoke, their voice sharp and urgent. We need to move this stuff tonight. If anyone finds out, we're done. What about the dog? Another asked. It's been snooping around too much. Max's ears flattened against his head. They knew about him. The figures stepped outside, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. Max stayed perfectly still, hidden behind a stack of crates. We'll deal with the dog if we see it again, one of them muttered. Max waited until they were distracted, then slipped away, his body low to the ground. His heart pounded as he ran, his instincts screaming at him to get back to the safety of the town. But Max knew safety wasn't enough. The town needed to act, and soon. Back in Willowbrook, Max found Jamie again. This time, he barked insistently, tugging at the boy's sleeve until Jamie understood. You want me to follow you again? Jamie asked. Max barked once, then turned and ran. This time, Jamie didn't hesitate. He grabbed his flashlight and followed Max back to the abandoned building, his fear overshadowed by curiosity. When they reached the lot, Max led him to the van. Jamie hesitated, then shone his flashlight inside. His eyes widened as he saw the barrels marked with hazardous symbols. What is this? Jamie whispered. Max barked softly, as if to say, danger. Jamie's heart raced as he stared at the barrels inside the van. The hazardous symbols were clear warnings, even to a kid. Whatever these men were doing wasn't just dangerous, it was illegal. He turned to Max, whose tail was low, his eyes sharp with urgency. We have to tell someone, Jamie whispered. Max barked once, a soft but firm sound that seemed to agree. But Jamie hesitated. Who would believe him? The sheriff hadn't taken him seriously, and his parents thought he was just imagining things. Jamie gripped the flashlight tighter. We'll need proof, he muttered, looking around a lot for anything he could take back to the authorities. Jamie crouched low, moving toward the van. Max stayed at his side, his body tense, ears swiveling at every sound. The boy's hands trembled as he reached for one of the barrels, trying to read the small print on its label. The words were faint in the dim light, but Jamie made out enough, highly flammable. Do not expose to open flame. His breath caught. What were these men planning to do with such dangerous materials? Just as he stepped back, a low voice carried through the night. Did you hear that? Jamie froze. Max tensed, his body poised to defend the boy if necessary. The flashlight beams cut through the darkness, sweeping across the lot. Jamie pressed himself against the side of the van, his heart pounding so loudly he was sure they'd hear it. Max stayed close, his body a shield between Jamie and the approaching men. What if it's that dog again, one voice muttered. Forget the dog, another snapped. We need to focus on the load. It all goes tonight. Jamie swallowed hard, his mind racing. He couldn't stay here much longer without being seen. He needed a plan and fast. Max seemed to sense Jamie's panic. Without warning, the dog darted out from behind the van, barking loudly to draw the men's attention. There it is, one of them shouted. Get it before it ruins everything. As the men chased after Max, Jamie seized his chance. He slipped away from the van, clutching a small piece of paper he'd torn from one of the barrels. It wasn't much, but it was proof that something dangerous was happening in that building. Jamie ran as fast as he could, his flashlight bobbing wildly in the dark. He didn't stop until he was back in town, his chest heaving and his legs trembling. Meanwhile, Max led the men on a wild chase through the lot, weaving between crates and dodging their grasping hands. Stupid dog, one of them snarled as Max slipped out of reach again. But Max wasn't just running aimlessly. He had a plan of his own. With a final burst of speed, he darted into the thick brush surrounding the lot, his small frame disappearing into the shadows. The men cursed and gave up, returning to the building in frustration. Max watched them go, his chest heaving from exertion but his eyes still sharp. He had bought Jamie the time he needed. Jamie didn't go home this time. He headed straight for the sheriff's office, banging on the door until the weary officer opened it. What is it now, Jamie? The sheriff asked, his tone laced with irritation. Jamie held up the torn piece of paper. I have proof this time. They're storing dangerous chemicals in that old building, stuff that could blow up the whole town. The sheriff frowned, taking the paper from the boy. He studied it for a moment, then sighed. Jamie, this isn't enough. It could be from anywhere. Jamie's frustration boiled over. You don't understand. Max showed me where it is. You have to come with me and see for yourself. The sheriff hesitated, glancing at the clock. It was late, and he had already written off the boy's story as a wild tale. But something in Jamie's eyes gave him pause, a determination that didn't match the imagination of a child. Fine, the sheriff said gruffly. Show me. With the sheriff in tow, Jamie led the way back to the abandoned building. Max was waiting near the edge of the lot, his tail wagging faintly as he saw the boy return. The sheriff raised an eyebrow. This is your proof? A stray dog. Jamie glared at him. Just follow us. Max didn't wait for further discussion. He turned and led them to the van, his movements deliberate and purposeful. When they reached the vehicle, Jamie shone his flashlight inside, illuminating the barrels. The sheriff's expression hardened as he took in the sight. I'll be damned, he muttered. Kid, you might be onto something after all. The sheriff radioed for backup, his tone urgent. We've got potential hazardous materials at the old mill building. Send a team immediately. As they waited, the sheriff turned to Jamie. You said they're planning to move this stuff tonight. Jamie nodded. That's what I heard. Max and I saw them loading the van earlier. The sheriff glanced at the dog, who stood proudly by Jamie's side. Smart mutt, he admitted reluctantly. While the sheriff inspected the van, Max wandered toward the building. His ears twitched as he caught faint voices from inside. He barked once, low and sharp, to get Jamie's attention. The boy hesitated, then followed Max to the side of the building. Peering through a broken window, he saw the men arguing over a map spread out on a table. "They're planning something big," Jamie whispered. The sheriff joined them, his expression grim as he took in the scene. "We need to stop them before they get away." The night was heavy with tension as the sheriff and his team surrounded the abandoned building. Flashlights cut through the darkness, and the faint sound of arguing voices echoed from inside. Jamie clutched Max's fur, his heart racing as the dog pressed closer to him, his body vibrating with anticipation. "Stay here," the sheriff ordered, though his stern tone softened when his eyes fell on Jamie. "You've done enough, kid." Jamie wasn't sure if it was a compliment or a dismissal, but he nodded reluctantly. Max, however, seemed to have other plans. Before anyone could stop him, Max darted toward the building, his paw silent against the dirt. Jamie gasped, but the sheriff placed a firm hand on his shoulder. "Let him go," he said quietly. "That dog knows what he's doing." As Max slipped inside, the tension outside was palpable. The officers waited for their moment, watching the building carefully. Suddenly, a muffled bang sounded from within, followed by shouting. "They're setting off something," one of the deputies yelled, raising his weapon. "No," Jamie whispered, his voice trembling. "They wouldn't." But then he saw it, a faint orange glow flickering through the cracked windows. "The barrels. They're trying to cover their tracks," the sheriff shouted, signaling his team to move in. Inside the building, Max moved with precision, his nose guiding him past scattered crates and stacks of old machinery. He reached the room where the men were gathered, barking furiously to draw their attention. "What the—" "It's that dog again," one of the men growled, kicking a chair toward Max. But Max wasn't deterred. He darted around the room, knocking over a small box near the table. The lid popped open, revealing papers, maps, documents, and diagrams that made it clear, this wasn't just about chemicals. It was a full-scale operation, and they were planning something big. The men froze as the sound of sirens grew louder outside. One of them cursed. "We've been found out." Jamie couldn't stand by any longer. As the sheriff's team prepared to storm the building, he broke free from their grasp and ran toward the door. "Jamie, no," the sheriff shouted, but the boy was already inside. Smoke filled the air, stinging Jamie's eyes as he coughed and pressed forward. "Max," he called out, his voice cracking. A bark answered him, and Jamie followed the sound, weaving through the chaos until he found Max standing guard over the fallen papers. The dog's eyes met Jamie's, full of urgency. Jamie didn't hesitate. He scooped up the papers and shoved them into his backpack, just as one of the men lunged toward him. "Get back here, you little—" But Max leaped into action, his teeth bared as he snarled and snapped at the man's leg. The man yelped, stumbling backward. "Good boy, Max," Jamie whispered, clutching the bag tightly. By the time Jamie and Max made it outside, the building was surrounded. Officers rushed in, and moments later, the men were being dragged out in handcuffs. The sheriff approached Jamie, his expression a mix of relief and frustration. "You could have gotten yourself killed, kid," he said, but his tone softened as he noticed the backpack. "What's that?" Jamie pulled out the papers, his hands trembling. "It's proof," he said. "They weren't just storing chemicals, they were planning to use them." The sheriff flipped through the documents, his face growing darker with each page. He glanced at Jamie, then at Max. "This dog of yours, he might have just saved the town." As the commotion settled and the fires were extinguished, an older man approached the scene. His clothes were worn, and his gait was slow, but his eyes lit up when he saw Max. "There you are, boy," the man said, his voice thick with emotion. Jamie watched, confused, as Max wagged his tail and trotted over to the man. The man knelt, scratching Max behind the ears. "This dog, he's been looking out for folks around here for years. Lost my home in a fire once, and he dragged me out before it was too late." Jamie's mouth fell open. "You're saying Max saved you?" The man nodded. "Not just me. This dog has a knack for being in the right place at the right time. Guess he's not just any stray." Word of Max's bravery spread quickly. By the next morning, the local news was filled with stories of the hero dog who had uncovered a dangerous plot. Neighbors who had once ignored Max now brought him food and water. Children ran up to pet him, their laughter filling the air. But for Jamie, Max wasn't just a hero. He was family. "You're staying with me now," Jamie said firmly, ruffling Max's fur. The dog licked his face, his tail wagging as if to say, "I wouldn't have it any other way." As the sun set over the town, Jamie sat on his porch with Max by his side. The events of the night still felt like a dream, but the documents were real, and so was the gratitude in the sheriff's eyes. "You're more than just a dog, Max," Jamie said softly, scratching behind his ears. "You're a lifesaver." "My lifesaver?" Max rested his head on Jamie's knee, his eyes calm and knowing. The boy smiled. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he belonged. And he had Max to thank for it. The next morning, Jamie woke to the sound of voices outside. Pulling on his sneakers, he stepped onto the porch to see a small crowd gathered in front of his house. Reporters with cameras and microphones were there, along with neighbors, townsfolk, and even the sheriff. Max sat proudly in the middle of it all, his tail wagging as children petted him and adults murmured their thanks. "Jamie," a reporter called out, her camera focused on him. "Is it true your dog uncovered the operation at the mill?" Jamie hesitated, his face turning red. "He's not really my dog," he admitted. "He is now," the sheriff interrupted, clapping a hand on Jamie's shoulder. "That mutt's been on his own for long enough. And from what I saw last night, the two of you make a pretty good team." The crowd murmured in agreement, and Jamie felt a swell of pride. Later that day, the town held an impromptu ceremony in the park. The mayor stood on a makeshift stage, holding a shiny medal. Beside him, Max sat patiently, his tongue lolling out as Jamie kept a protective hand on his collar. "This town owes its safety to the bravery of one exceptional dog," the mayor declared, his voice carrying through the crowd. "Max showed us all the true meaning of loyalty and courage. And today, we honor him as our hero." The mayor bent down, fastening the medal around Max's neck. The crowd erupted into cheers, and Max barked happily, wagging his tail as if he understood the honor. Jamie beamed, his chest swelling with pride. For the first time, he felt like he was part of something bigger, like he and Max belonged. As the celebration continued, the older man who had appeared the night before approached Jamie again. This time, he had a folded piece of paper in his hand. "I've been meaning to tell you," the man said, his voice soft. "Max isn't just any stray. He's been through more than most dogs and people." Jamie frowned. "What do you mean?" The man handed him the paper. It was a weathered photograph of a younger Max, standing beside a woman in a military uniform. Her name was Clara, the man explained. She was Max's original owner. She trained him as a rescue dog for disaster zones. But when she passed, Max found his way here. He's been looking after this town ever since. Jamie stared at the photo, his throat tight. "So, he's always been a hero?" The man nodded. "Always. And now, he's found you." Over the next few weeks, Jamie and Max settled into a routine. The town rallied around them, offering help whenever they could. Jamie's parents, once skeptical about Max, grew to adore him, and his father even built a small doghouse in the backyard, though Max rarely used it, preferring to stay by Jamie's side. The sheriff visited often, bringing treats for Max and updates on the case. Those men were part of a larger group, he told Jamie one afternoon. "Thanks to you and Max, we've got enough evidence to stop them for good." Jamie felt a surge of pride. He looked down at Max, who was chewing on a bone. "We did it, boy," he said, scratching behind the dog's ears. Max's bravery didn't just change Jamie's life, it changed the whole town. People who once ignored the stray now went out of their way to care for other animals. Local shelters reported a spike in adoptions, and the old mill, once a symbol of neglect, was cleaned up and turned into a community center. Jamie watched it all with a sense of wonder. He'd always felt like an outsider, but now, he was part of something bigger. And it was all thanks to Max. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Jamie sat on the porch with Max by his side. The dog's metal gleamed faintly in the fading light, a reminder of everything they'd been through. "You're more than just a dog, Max," Jamie said softly. "You're my best friend." Max licked his hand, his eyes filled with unspoken understanding. Jamie smiled. For the first time in a long time, he felt truly at home. And as the stars filled the sky, he knew one thing for sure: together, he and Max could face anything. The following days brought a whirlwind of activity. The town, once quiet and forgotten, was now buzzing with reporters, law enforcement officials, and townsfolk eager to piece together the events surrounding the abandoned mill. At the center of it all were Jamie and Max. The sheriff stood outside the mill, addressing a crowd of reporters. "Thanks to the bravery and quick thinking of this young man and his dog, we were able to uncover a dangerous operation that could have endangered countless lives. The men responsible are in custody, and the town is safe once again." Jamie listened from the sidelines, his cheeks flushing as camera lenses turned toward him. But the true star of the moment was Max, sitting proudly at Jamie's side, his tail thumping against the ground. Inside the courthouse, the once confident leader of the operation, a man named Briggs, sat in shackles. His smug demeanor had disappeared, replaced by a nervous twitch as he listened to the charges being read. "You thought you could use this town as your playground," the judge said sternly, his voice echoing through the chamber. "But thanks to the courage of a boy and his dog, your plans have been stopped. You'll be spending a long time behind bars." Briggs sneered, but the weight of the sentence left no room for argument. Jamie, sitting in the audience with Max at his feet, felt a sense of closure wash over him. Back in town, a celebration was underway. The mayor stood on the steps of City Hall, holding a proclamation in one hand and a shiny plaque in the other. "Today, we honor two unlikely heroes," he announced, his voice filled with emotion. "Jamie, for his bravery and quick thinking. And Max, for his incredible loyalty and courage." The crowd erupted into applause as Jamie and Max stepped forward. Jamie accepted the plaque with a shy smile, while Max wagged his tail enthusiastically, basking in the attention. The mayor bent down, attaching a new tag to Max's collar. It read, "Max, Hero of Mill Creek." For Jamie, the recognition wasn't just about the applause or the plaque. It was about the way people now saw him. The boy who had once felt invisible was now greeted with smiles and waves wherever he went. "Hey, Jamie," a shopkeeper called out as he passed. "How's our town hero doing?" Jamie grinned, his confidence growing with each kind word. At school, things were different, too. The kids who used to tease him now wanted to sit with him at lunch. Teachers who barely noticed him before now praised his courage. But Jamie stayed grounded, always quick to deflect the credit to Max. For Max, life as a hero was sweet. No longer a stray scrounging for scraps, he now had a warm bed at Jamie's house, regular meals, and endless affection. The town treated him like royalty, with people bringing treats and toys wherever he went. But Max never let it go to his head. He remained the same loyal, determined dog who had risked everything to protect the town. Jamie often found him sitting on the porch, gazing out at the horizon as if he were still keeping watch. The events at the mill had a ripple effect on the entire town. The once abandoned building was repurposed into a community center, a place where people could gather, learn, and connect. The local animal shelter saw a surge in adoptions, inspired by Max's story. Stray dogs and cats found loving homes, and the town began organizing regular events to support animal welfare. Jamie and Max often attended these events, sharing their story to inspire others. Jamie's parents, who had once been skeptical of Max, grew to love him like a member of the family. One evening, as they sat together at the dinner table, Jamie's dad spoke up. "You know, Jamie, I wasn't sure about bringing Max home at first. But I can see now, he's exactly what we needed." Jamie smiled, scratching Max behind the ears. "He's the best thing that ever happened to me." His mom nodded, her eyes soft. "And to all of us." As the weeks turned into months, Jamie and Max's bond only deepened. They became inseparable, facing each new day as a team. One afternoon, the sheriff stopped by with an idea. "Jamie," he said, kneeling to pat Max's head, "this dog has some real talent. Have you ever thought about training him for search and rescue?" Jamie's eyes lit up. "You think he could do it?" The sheriff chuckled. "I think he's already proven he can." And so, Jamie and Max began a new chapter, working with professionals to hone Max's natural abilities. Together, they trained tirelessly, preparing for the day they might save even more lives. One crisp autumn evening, Jamie sat on the porch with Max curled up at his feet. The town was quiet, the stars twinkling above them. Jamie thought back to that fateful night at the mill and all that had happened since. "You changed everything, Max," he said softly, stroking the dog's fur. "Not just for me, for everyone." Max lifted his head, his eyes meeting Jamie's with a warmth that needed no words. Jamie smiled, leaning back against the porch railing. He knew their journey was far from over, but for now, he was content. Together, he and Max had faced the impossible and come out stronger. As the sun set over Mill Creek, casting a golden hue over the town, Jamie sat on the porch with Max by his side. The world around them was calm, now peaceful. The same streets that once felt silent and empty now buzzed with a new sense of connection. People waved as they walked by, and the air was filled with laughter. It was as if the whole town had been awakened by one simple act of courage. Jamie ran his hand through Max's fur, his thoughts drifting back to that fateful night at the mill. Back then, everything had seemed so uncertain. Max, the stray dog, had been overlooked by many. Jamie had been the shy boy no one noticed. But together, they had changed everything. He thought about how the town had looked at Max when he first arrived, the way people ignored him, pushed him away, even treated him like he didn't matter. It was the same way Jamie had felt for most of his life, unseen, forgotten, unimportant. But Max had never stopped trying. He had never let the world decide what he was worth. And because of that, lives had been saved, and hearts had been changed. Max had proven something that the world often forgets: heroism doesn't always wear a uniform. Sometimes, it wears fur. Sometimes, it walks on four legs and has a wagging tail. Sometimes, it shows up when you least expect it, offering loyalty, courage, and love without asking for anything in return. As the night air began to cool, Jamie looked down at Max, his heart full of gratitude. He wasn't just thankful for what Max had done for the town, or for the way he had changed his life. He was thankful for the way Max had shown him that being small, or being overlooked, didn't mean you couldn't make a big difference. It didn't mean you couldn't be brave. "You really are something special, aren't you?" Jamie said softly, his voice filled with awe. Max looked up at him, his eyes full of understanding, as if he knew exactly what Jamie meant. The dog leaned against his leg, and Jamie smiled, realizing that he had never been alone. Not truly. It had taken Max's quiet strength to show Jamie that courage wasn't about loud actions or grand gestures. Sometimes, it was simply about standing tall in the face of fear, showing up when others expect you to walk away. It was about fighting for what's right, no matter how hard the path might seem. Max had been the proof that even the most unnoticed creatures could be heroes. That even the smallest, most ignored things had a story worth telling. And that sometimes, the world doesn't need to see everything about you to know the difference you've made. The stars above were starting to shine, one by one, filling the night sky with their quiet brilliance. And for the first time in his life, Jamie felt like he was part of something bigger. Like he mattered. And Max? He lay there beside him, content, watching the world with the same unshakable loyalty that had saved so many lives. It didn't matter that he had once been a stray, a dog others had overlooked. He had proven what the world so often forgets: heroism comes in many forms, and it isn't always seen at first glance. Sometimes, Jamie whispered, his voice filled with a quiet truth, the strongest heroes don't wear capes. Sometimes, they're just waiting to be noticed. Max's tail thumped softly against the porch, as if to say, exactly. And with that simple gesture, the world felt right. The town, once filled with shadows, was now full of light. And that light? It had come from an unlikely hero. From Max, the dog who had believed in Jamie when no one else did. The dog who had believed in the town when no one else cared. In the end, it's not about the recognition or the applause. It's about the quiet acts of courage, the love that asks for nothing in return, and the hope that we can always be better than what the world expects of us. And sometimes, it's those who are least expected to make a difference who change everything. Max and Jamie had shown everyone that, no matter how small or overlooked, each of us has the power to change the world one act of courage at a time. And that was the lesson Jamie would carry with him forever. As for Max, he had already shown the world just how big a heart could be in the smallest of packages. And he had proven that a wagging tail and an unshakable loyalty were sometimes all it took to change a life and a whole town.